We are back, and we are joined now by Roberto Lovato, a Salvadoran-American writer, assistant professor of English at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. He's the author of the book Unforgetting, a memoir of family, migration, gangs, and revolution in the Americas. Roberto, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Oh, real pleasure to be with you, Emma.
Great to hear from you. We can hear him all right? All right, okay, awesome. My headphones are a little weird, so apologies, Roberto. But before we talk about Bukele and his visit today, I think it's helpful to give some people a sense of El Salvador's history with the United States, Bukele's place in it. You were born in the United States, but I know that your family's from El Salvador, and you've spent your life working in academia, journalism, but also nonprofits helping Salvadoran immigrants. So it seems to me that you've had a foot in both worlds. Can you tell us a little bit more about your background and how it informs your work?
Yeah, I was born in San Francisco's Mission District, home to Carlos Santana, and I kind of identify as a child of the 70s when Santana's music reflects the way that all these different currents of consciousness, Black power, brown power, gay power, women's power, and the power of social movements, especially in Central America, were kind of coming together. I grew up in that environment, and right in pre-Trump, in pre-Musk Silicon Valley. So I also saw the rise of techno-fascism in the Bay Area. And so as a kid, I was in a gang, and had to get out of that and joined a right-wing evangelical church that today would have made me an evangelical fascist. But I learned to be a militant in the church and left it, and then eventually ended up in El Salvador trying to find myself, and found myself in the middle of a war, which was affecting my family and friends of my family. And I started doing work with refugee communities there. And first I started with refugee groups in San Francisco, and then I went to El Salvador and worked with refugee groups there and saw things that no human being should see done to children, elderly, and others. And I decided that just doing kind of liberal service work was insufficient to the moment, and made the difficult decision to join the FMLN guerrillas. I'm still paying the price psychologically for that, and I've also learned a great deal. And so I then became a writer, journalist, and eventually professor now here at UNLV, and am astounded at how the circuits of violence and fascistic, neo-fascistic, and techno-fascistic kind of politics have turned El Salvador, this tiny country that people didn't even know when I was a kid, into a global center of neo-fascist theory and practice.
Right. And let's trace that history a little bit. And even we can start with your upbringing and how you say you were in a clique. And right now we're seeing the Trump administration attempt to justify its fascism by painting migrants as criminals. We hear a lot about Tren de Aragua, which is associated with Venezuela, and MS-13, which is associated with El Salvador. Can you speak a little bit about how you found connection in the clique as you describe it, and how gang ties, very loosely described, are being used against people from El Salvador to really demonize them, frankly?
Yeah, one of the things I do in my book is show the human conditions that create gangs and gang members. I was a part of a small clique in San Francisco, nothing like the really hardcore gangs, either here in the US, like the Mexican Mafia, and other gangs, or Crips and Bloods, and MS-13 and 18th Street in El Salvador, which are structures based on US-style gangs. And so I found friendship and community in a little clique that was, not mostly nonviolent, except that different moments. We were involved in drugs and other stuff, but we were not the hardened, heavy weapon wielding gangs of today. And so I started working with gangs in the 90s in LA, where the gangs were born, MS 13 and 18th Street. And, 13, for example, is the letter M, is the number of the letter M, that the Salvadoran gangs who were being, before they were gangs, they were being bullied and beaten by larger, mostly Black gangs in South LA, and decided to start arming themselves with machetes. And then journalists like Lisa Ling started noticing that these gangs had machetes instead of guns, and started labeling them as extremely violent. And and then the gangs took on the more familiar tattooed faces, tattooed bodies, and more heavily armed gang structures and culture that we know today. And so I've watched as the US local and then federal governments have started taking interest in these gangs. And the project has been bipartisan, Democrat and Republican. They've both escalated and used the gangs to legitimate initially local policing of young people. Now you're seeing it become this terrorist
federalized
that has Lisa Link started calling MS-13 the most dangerous gang in the world, even though you never have any statistical basis to prove any gang is the most violent in the world. It's ridiculous. Right. In fact, when you look at in 2019, when Trump started using the word terrorist as applied to Salvadoran gangs, and then as Bukele was elected that same year, he starts using the term aggressively, and you see how the terrorist word is being thrown around. I started interviewing cops, police in San Francisco and other cities, and found out, for example, that in 2019 you had 3 white men wielding semi-automatic weapons. These 3 white men killed more people in 2019 than the allegedly 10,000 MS-13 and 18th Street gang members in the US combined. So let me repeat that. Three white men with semi-automatic weapons killed more people in 2019 than all of the 10,000 MS-13 and 18th Street gang members in the United States.
Yeah.
This is the degree to which the media display you're seeing in the meeting between Bukele and Trump is entirely political theater on steroids.
Right. And it's you see, frankly, like as you alluded to, the explosion of tactics that have been long used against Latino and Black young men in cities in this country, gang databases, right? Now being basically used at the federal level, where if you're somebody who's from a specific area of Venezuela, or if you're from El Salvador and you may know somebody or have been in a community with somebody who's in one of these gangs that they trump up as, not to use a pun, as more dangerous than they are, that basically classifies you as a part of some broader criminal organization, and now not just criminal, according to this far-right Trump administration, terrorist.
Yeah, the franchise of criminalization and now terrorization of different groups of people is well underway, and it's the biggest, most dangerous thing that's coming out of the Trump-Bukele meeting. It's telling, for example, that during the meeting today, Bukele said, and I quote, "Sometimes they say that we imprison thousands. I like to say that we actually liberated millions." And Trump replies, "Who gave him that line? Do you think I can use that?" And so these the meeting reflects, I think, the expansion of the local, national, hemispheric, and global enterprise of terrorization of increasing numbers of groups. You start off with the lowest hanging violent fruit, like the gangs, and they are violent, and some of them are murderous. Most of them are not. Most of the gang members are not murders. Okay, otherwise you'd have over 10,000 deaths in MS-13 in the U.S. when you have an insignificant number statistically doing that. So you start off with gangs, then you extend it to immigrants generally, as you see Stephen Miller's career, growing, and Trump's own election built on that. And then you extend it to, like in El Salvador, journalists dealing with gangs have been arrested, harassed, persecuted, some even exiled. And then you extend it to activists. You start using the word activist to talk about, like you're talking about the Palestinian activist in Colombia, or the Turkish woman who was arrested by,
at Tufts.
At Tufts.
Yeah.
Or Mr. Abrego Garcia, who is still in the Secot gulag that Bukele just built. All of these immigrants are now illustrations of how the franchise is extending. But make no mistake, coming your way soon is the franchise of terrorization to those of us that are citizens. It's already afoot. Trump is already talking about deporting citizens to El Salvador, U.S. citizens.
Yep.
And so, this is where like my experience first growing up in pre-techno-fascist Bay Area, and then as a journalist who's reported on electronic surveillance, that, as I watched it go from the analog industrial age to the digital age of surveillance, has taught me that people like Bukele are digital dictators. We're in the age of digital dictatorship, and the industrial age structures of, like, my former comrades in the FMLN could not defeat the digital dictatorship model of Bukele. And so we have to upgrade our social movements for the digital age if we are to fight people like Bukele, who has benefited from CIA-trained Venezuelan assets, who became consultants to Bukele and helped him kind of manufacture this bizarre and dangerous reality in El Salvador that has large segments of the populace supporting him in their desperation.
I really want to get to that, and also your astute comments about the Bay Area and what it's become, because so much of what you're saying reminds me of another Bay Area journalist we had on, Gil Duran, and his study of these right-wing techno-fascists. But you mentioned the CIA and its current involvement in El Salvador's politics, but it did not obviously begin there. The United States sent billions of dollars in military aid to El Salvador's government in the 80s, and it was a violent, repressive regime. If you could give us a little bit of that history as we lead into explaining how Bukele fits into that history, that would be great.
Yeah, El Salvador was, for the better part of the 20th century, one of the longest standing military dictatorships in the world, in the hemisphere and in the world. And it's always been as well it was the first place to launch an indigenous and communist insurrection against dictatorship in the Americas in 1932, when approximately 32,000, somewhere between 10 to 50,000, we still don't know, because the memory of that has been erased in official records. People were killed by their own government. And so the violence and murder of El Salvador has ingrained itself in the political and even the social culture of El Salvador, where, for example, dictatorship after dictatorship was continually torturing, killing, disappearing, exiling, and perpetrating other actions to terrorize their way into domination. So in the 60s and in the 50s and 60s, you start seeing the birth of groups following Che Guevara and Fidel Castro in the Americas that were revolutionary, mostly Marxist-Leninist revolutionary organizations that eventually in the 1980s became the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front, el Frente Farabundo Martí para la Liberación Nacional. And the FMLN waged a successful war to dismantle the military dictatorship. Sadly, and tragically, the FMLN did not retool itself for the digital age. The analog age, Marxist-Leninist political military structures did not get upgraded for the world that Silicon Valley created. And so eventually you get in the 90s, the right-wing fascist Arena Party instituting what's known as mano dura, hard hand politics, in response to the gang problem that was growing after the war, because Bush administration one Attorney General Bill Barr started targeting gangs in the U.S., making up until that time the largest shift in FBI resources from counterintelligence to focus on gangs in 1992 in response to the LA riots. He also began the practice of deporting gang members to El Salvador and then the rest of Central America, a region ripe with ruins and perfectly fit to grow US-style, LA-style gang structures like the Mexican mafia. And so that's where you get MS-13 and 18th Street growing out of the rotten soil of US policy in the US.
Deportations.
Of deportations and gang policing.
Right, right. So they fed one another, right? And I guess it created almost a cycle of, you have, sorry to cut you off here, Roberto, but it's such a key point. MS-13 originating in the US prison system, informing deportation policies, sending those folks back to El Salvador, building up their resources and creating, almost strengthening them, but also tying in US kind of gang policing into the immigration carceral state. That's so key in the 90s and into the 2000s.
Oh, you're right on point, Emma. In addition to that, you see the kind of robocopization of US policing and El Salvador's actual influence on it. You had people like a guy named the late Max Manwaring, who a former US Pentagon colonel, who and strategist and professor, distinguished professor in the U.S. Army College, starting his career focusing on insurgency and counterinsurgency in El Salvador. After the war, what does Manwaring do? He goes and he starts looking at gangs as the new insurgency and starts framing gangs as insurgency. There's a line that runs from that kind of thinking to the terrorist language you see being used today. And then some of the many trainers that the U.S. sent to El Salvador after the war ended in 1992 went where? To San Francisco, LA, New York, to train U.S. police forces in counterinsurgency. Okay, and then you have, over the years, U.S. presidents, including Obama, for example, heavily militarizing U.S. police. So you have in El Salvador a tiny country with an outsized contributions to the militarization of the United States itself.
Mm-hmm. And even the militarization of the police, that's an outgrowth of the war on terror, which is where we come full circle of the classifying of these folks as terrorists, because we did the same thing with the Mujahideen. We know that the United States has enabled far-right governments, not just in South America or Latin America, but also in the Middle East. And then that's come back to bite us because they become well, maybe not even bite us, but it benefits these people because then the military budget increases and the surveillance state increases, and this is a new group of people to go after. It's just a completely incongruent policy if you actually care about safety and not just the carceral state and making some money. Like that it creates cycles of violence is really what I'm saying. And it doesn't seem like we're diving even further into just a more digitized version of that policy. You write about it as a digitized neoliberal 21st century fascista, which is so well said. Like, how does that look when you bring in the surveillance technology piece?
Well, it looks like things you see in sci-fi movies. I don't teach sci-fi writing, but I'm a fan of sci-fi writing and sci-fi movies. One of my favorite being The Matrix. You're living in The Matrix right now in many ways. As far as the stimulation of reality, what takes place in the White House right now between Bukele and Trump is an entire stimulation when you have this terrorist language being applied indiscriminately and without any basis in reality. When you're going to start seeing it extend the brand of terror, the terrorist brand, into different groups that are going to include many of us, unless we build something else that El Salvador has to teach us, which are the social movements that are the only things that are going to be able to challenge the rise of fascism. We're not going to liberal progressive our way out of climate change, techno-fascism. It's proven time and again in the case of El Salvador, in the case of gangs, in the case of immigration, for example. Immigration, by the way, being the royal road that leads to fascism, not just in the U.S. but throughout the world, right? In Europe and even in the Americas. In the case of these, the escalation of this techno-fascist practice, we're going to have to build the social movements that kind of include elements of liberal progressivism. We're going to have to be a little more radical and to the left of that if we're to get through this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess that brings us to more of a modern context, because Bukele is right now meeting with Donald Trump, as you say. Apparently, he has now said he won't be releasing Kilmar Armando Garcia, calling him a terrorist. Trump is openly flirting, standing next to him with the idea of sending, quote, homegrowns to the El Salvador prison. What is this guy's background? You mentioned the FMLN, the left-wing political party in El Salvador, that he was initially a part of, but he was expelled from in 2017. Can you talk about how that happened, why that happened, and how this guy cut his teeth politically?
Yeah, I mean, sadly, some of the leadership in the FMLN, my former comrades, got corrupted by power and money. And they embraced and couldn't see the danger of a rich boy, technologically sophisticated rich boy named Nayib Bukele. And he was not in any way a part of the history of the FMLN, what I would call the heroic history of the FMLN prior to becoming the dominant political force in El Salvador in the 2000s. And so there was a parting of ways between Bukele and the FMLN when Bukele was mayor. And Bukele went on to establish a political party known as Nuevas Ideas, the New Ideas Party, which actually did have new ideas, but the new ideas they're not telling you is techno-fascism, right? Taking elements of the FMLN's oppositional discourse and combining it with the traditional fascist militaristic practices of the Arena Party, also an industrial age structure. Bukele managed to, with the help of his Venezuelan digital consultants who worked to against Hugo Chavez and Maduro, they concocted this whole new way to dominate in the digital age. People talk about the spectacle of politics. This is the spectacle of politics in extreme, and it's right there in front of us, and people are consuming it as if the spectacle was reality. When you have, for example, Bukele displaying gang members on the floor, these famous pictures, he was showing how to cover up the extermination, the torture, the disappearances of previous governments, including the FMLN government, sadly, when it came to gangs. So instead of continuing he continues the worst of military dictatorship, but does it under the guise of this digital democratic spectacle that
right. Is he involved in cryptocurrency as well? I mean,
yes.
Right. That's I mean, you also see that down in Argentina. There is a growing crypto techno-fascist movement that has close ties with Elon Musk and the Trump administration in a variety of different countries. Even as there are some success stories in South America with left-wing governments, there are, on the other side of the spectrum, these far-right kind of dictatorships. Bukele, similarly, is my understanding, is not really interested in governing very much. He hasn't done anything in office except some of this fascistic, notorious prisons where he has complete control over them and can throw in anybody he wants. A lot of it's just crypto scams, is my read of things.
Absolutely. Crypto has not delivered for El Salvador. In fact, it's put it into more debt. And crypto is just another part of the digital political theater that you see in the prisons, that you see in the meeting today, that you see running through and through Bukele's project. And I'm glad you mentioned Latin America, because there's still pockets and large swaths of hope to be had in the Americas, arguably the most insurgent continent in the world when it comes to opposition to U.S. empire. And so there's a whole history there that the FMLN in its better days was a part of. That's part of why I wrote my book, to preserve the history and remind people. I mean, it was no easy thing for me, a U.S. citizen, to come out as a former guerrilla fighter. But Trump helped me to make that decision, because I realized that there was some great learning to be had in the revolutionary tradition, a word that we don't even use hardly anymore, revolucion in the US. We've forgotten that there's a whole tradition in the world that was a revolutionary tradition. And so we have to kind of go to the only thing really proven to defeat fascists over the course of history has been revolutionary movements, by and large. And we're going to need that now. So what that means, I don't have all the answers. That's beyond my pay grade. But I do know that we need to do in our social movements what psychologists, for example, do with the kids that I've interviewed in the jails of Obama, Trump, and Biden, which is to reconstitute their, the kids' brains shrink when you put them in these cages in prisons for an extended period. And psychologists treated them, told me that the way they deal with them is to help the kids reconstitute their story of themselves in a way that connects. There's a part of us that's indestructible, because there's a part of us spiritually, psychologically, that's indestructible. And so liberal progressivism doesn't put us in touch with that part of our radical imagination, our radical core. And I think we need to start thinking about how do we build not just individuals, but social movements that re-engineer themselves to come back in touch with the things that make for real social change. I can't see how we're going to liberal progressive our way out of fascism. I don't. I think time and again.
Well, liberalism is enabling fascism right now. I mean, we're seeing it with the liberal institutional law firms in the country, because even if you're liberal on being open to other cultures, being laissez-faire liberal in the marketplace means you're always going to abandon the secondary cultural and social liberalism for the primary means of power in society, which is wealth under capitalism. That's what we're seeing.
Absolutely. I mean, I wrote a piece for The Nation a while back on something I call intersectional empire, which is the alternative that Democrats have offered us. You're not doing anything to dismantle empire. You're just advancing it under a gay flag with a black president and women in the cabinet and, helicopters with the gay flag on them and stuff. And so the LGBTQ flag. And so that's the alternative that liberalism is offering us. And we are betrayed time and again by liberal Democrats, though at some point we need to have a big tent social movement on a national and hemispheric level that brings in all the different forces opposed to the techno-fascist order that's being established in the US and across the hemisphere with El Salvador, with Argentina. We have to really go back to the oldie but goodie idea of, think globally, act locally, and connect globally in ways we haven't in the past. I do have hope, however. I see, just like when I was in New York, I saw Occupy when it was coming. I see the possibilities in a global movement that will surpass the scale and scope and intensity of the '68 movement because of our ability to connect to each other in ways that are unprecedented from then to now. And so that is my great hope, that we saw, for example, in the movement against the genocide in Palestine, the interconnectedness of the world acting in unison for social justice, and that previews also the reasons why you have the attacks of the Trumps and the Bukeles and the expansion of the franchise of the terrorization of different groups of people, including students. Eventually, you're going to get to labor people. You're going to start expanding this. And so the more aware, the opportunity in Trump and Bukele's meeting is to become aware of the unification of the global right that is going to bring about the unification of the global left.
Well, from your mouth to God's ears, Roberto, thanks so much for coming on the show today. Roberto Lovato, you can read his book, Unforgetting, a memoir of family, migration, gangs, and revolution in the Americas. We'll put a link to that below wherever people are listening to or watching this. Thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Emma. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.